Thank you all for being here today. It's so great to see you. Welcome to MIT Press Live. I'm Emily Tabor. I'm the Acquisitions Editor for Economics, Finance, and Business here at the MIT Press, and I'll be hosting today's talk. And I'm very excited for you to meet today's guests, Jerry Kane, a professor of information systems at Boston College, Han Phillips, a research director for Deloitte's Global CEO program, and Rich Nanda, a principal at Deloitte Consulting LLP, where he leads the strategy practice. And of course, all three are co-authors of The Transformation Myth with Jonathan Kopulski, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. So welcome, panelists.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So this fall, the MIT Press published The Transformation Myth, Leading Your Organization Through Uncertain Times. Could you tell us a little bit about this project and how it came to be?
Well, Emily, as you know, we were, this author team, or at least three of the four, had published a previous book called The Technology Fallacy, How People Are the Real Key to Digital Transformation. And we had been working on a follow-up book for that. And we actually had submitted to you the proposal for that book in late February, early March 2020. And by the time we got down to have a pitch meeting, to talk about it, the world had changed over the course of the following weeks. And it was clear that we were sort of going through a generational defining event. So literally, as we were having that conversation about what the book was going to be, it just, over the course of that month, felt incredibly dated already and missing the point. And we said, well, what if we explored these issues in relation to what many companies are dealing with respect to COVID? And you and Paul, you got excited about that opportunity. And he said, that would be great, except you have to have us the manuscript by November. And so we said, oh, great, November. And we panicked because we had to go from idea to research to book to finished product in the course of about 9 months. And it was extremely stressful, but extraordinarily rewarding as we talked with executives and leaders who were sort of leading their organization through unprecedented and uncertain times. And, I came out of this project far more optimistic than I would have ever thought, because it really, we heard so many stories of inspirational leadership from the executives we talked to.
That's great. So I understand that you have a presentation prepared, so I will sort of turn things over to you. But before I do that, I just want to let folks know that if you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll be putting some instructions on how to do the Q&A in the chat in just a moment, so you can
okay, so
have any
maybe
questions.
going to Heather, because my screen just completely freaked out. So let me figure this out. It's blue. Okay, let me see if I can share.
You're testing your nimbleness, Jerry.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Let's see if, can you see it now?
There we go. Yes.
Okay, slide 2 works. I don't know why slide 1 didn't work. So slide 1 was just the transformation myth, leading your organization through uncertain times, which is essentially my backdrop here. So we can move on. What we're looking at in this book is really how organizations respond to disruption. And we're very careful. We were using COVID as an opportunity to study disruption and study how companies were adapting. And yet throughout the book, we're very clear that it is not about COVID for a couple of reasons. One, we think that the lessons that we discovered, apply to all sorts of disruptions. And we talk about these in terms of acute versus chronic disruption. And so what we discovered in I'll get to that in a minute, in a later slide. But then as we were investigating COVID, it also became clear that it wasn't just about COVID. It was also about racial injustice that we saw global rising awareness of. It continued to be about climate change. It continued to be about political disruption. It continued to be about economic and supply chain disruption that was happening. And so it was really disruption upon disruption upon disruption that companies were trying to figure out how to manage. And we realized, that although we were studying COVID, there was not going to get to a point where we would be done with disruption. And so that really constant disruption and constant change is the nature of our world today. And so, well, that's what we talk about in the transformation myth, that it's not just about adapting to a disruption. It's not just about transforming one and done. It's really about ongoing change in the midst of multiple overlapping disruptions. The second thing we learned is as we talk to more people, they specifically recalled what they did in response to prior disruption to affect their decisions today. For instance, we were talking to the chief brand officer at Hilton, and he said, immediately we let people out of their obligations, because what we learned from 2001 and September 11th, that if we were too hard and stricting to holding people accountable for their plans, they'd get resentful, and we just end up changing it anyway. So why don't we learn we're going to do this? We can be magnanimous. We can let people out of the reservations that they had without any penalty, and we're going to build up great brand loyalty as a result of that. And executive after executive talked about referring to these previous crises, whether it's the financial crisis, the Icelandic volcano eruption. We talk about KLM, how that airline dealt with disruption through that, and how all of these lessons help inform executives and help them make decisions in uncertain times. And we're hoping that that's really the takeaway from this book, is not a discussion of COVID and what companies did, but what can we learn from this extraordinary year and a half to help inform our organizations going forward. And this is where we talk about sort of the distinction in types of disruption, because we realize that the lessons of our previous book, The Technology Fallacy, really applied quite well to what companies were dealing with respect to COVID. We tried to figure out why that was the case, and we talk about it in terms of acute versus chronic disruption. Digital disruption is chronic disruption. It happens over a longer period of time. It's slow building and persistent. It's not always obvious, but it's disruption nonetheless. COVID, however, was an acute disruption. It's sudden, rapid, and severe, obvious and attention-grabbing. You don't have any choice but to deal with it. But many companies were saying, the plans we had in place to deal with digital disruption worked really well with respect to COVID, and we didn't change anything. We just accelerated what we were doing. So moving on. What is the transformation myth? Again, it's the myth that transformation is an event with a start and an end, where organizations migrate from one steady state to another, as opposed to this continual process of adapting to a highly volatile, ambiguous, and uncertain environment shaped by multiple overlapping disruptions. And we think that the answer, the commonality between both types of disruption, acute and chronic, is what we call the growth mindset. It's not what we call the growth mindset. We borrowed it from Carol Dweck, the Stanford psychologist, except we're extending it to the organizational level. It's this belief that innovation is the key to growth, and it's possible to acquire the capabilities to thrive through disruption. You see two quotes over here, one from Nadella of Microsoft, and he's a real fan of this growth mindset concept. And then Andy Rubin, CEO of Trove, that we interviewed for the book. He said, it's in moments of incredible change, that's when companies that are the most nimble survive. We've asked, what are the 15 things that we've known we've had to do but never gotten our shot? We adapted the mindset that this is our moment and we can't miss the moment. And we see that over and over from our executives, that the COVID was not the excuse to sort of batten down the hatches and retreat to the familiar. It was an opportunity for innovation. And we saw many examples of that. And we talk about responding to disruption in a three-phase framework. First is respond. And this for COVID was basically March, April, May of 2020. It's how do you figure out how do you keep the lights on? How do we make sure the organization can keep functioning? Second stage is recover. And this is how you learn and emerge stronger. You start taking sense of the environment and what is different, what is better, what is worse, and where do the opportunities get created in all of this. And then last but not least is thrive. How does an organization prepare for and shape the new normal? We would argue most of what we've been dealing with respect to COVID has been in the recover phase up until now. It's only once sort of are we going back to the office more regularly, is life returning to much more normal, that we can get into this thrive. And I think one of the key takeaways of the book is our belief that the bigger disruption of COVID still lies ahead of us, because you've had 18 months of companies getting more nimble and agile and resilient. And once they can go back out in the marketplace, they're going to have all sorts of new capabilities to compete, and they're going to be able to attract talent in different ways. And they're going to have different organizational forms. And we think that the real disruption still lies ahead, and we should use what we've learned over the past 18 months and not go back to the way the world was in December of 2019, but to go forward and be very intentional about the type of organizations and the type of businesses we're going to create. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Rich, who's going to take our next portion of the program.
Great, thanks, Jerry, and hello to everyone in the audience. So building on Jerry's comments, what's interesting is, while we know that technology isn't, the end game, what we also know, and it's very clear from our research, that digitally mature companies actually got to thrive sooner than companies that were less digitally mature. And what is the role of technology in making companies more adept at transformation and innovation? And we thought that was an important topic worth exploring. But what we can start with, building on the technology fallacy, is that, it's very clear that technology cannot just be the responsibility of the CIO or the CTO and their organization. Technology is not a singular thing that is a silver bullet to, create every opportunity and solve every problem. We know that technology isn't greater than business strategy, nor is strategy greater than technology. They need to work in concert with one another. We also know that, look, just acting or pretending to act like a digitally native company, that's not going to get companies to thrive in this disruption either. And we also know that the script isn't written, right? That newcomers will rule the day. We know that incumbents and legacy companies have very powerful and distinct advantages that, when coupled with transformative innovation, the ability to use technology, can make them even stronger competitors and incumbents. Now, but why is there, what's the phenomenon that's leading digitally mature companies to be able to thrive more quickly? And what's going on in the external environment that's making that the case? And what our research has shown is that the pace of innovation around technology is increasing. So those that have a mastery of absorbing and applying technology tend to be able to take advantage of that innovation better. And maybe more importantly, the vertical axis on this chart, the role of technology is coming closer and closer to how companies compete. And it's going from being something that enabled operations or the back office to something that actually enables how you acquire or retain customers, how you bring talent into the organization. And as the kind of the nature of technology continues to come closer and closer to how companies compete, it becomes very clear then that those that can master technology in a way that's advantageous to the purpose of the organization, will be stronger and stronger players. So technology, while it's not the end game and it's the means to the end, it's becoming a more and more critical means to the ends of organizations. And finally, just spelling it out here, we found there were 4 capabilities that technology enabled in companies, and we'd say should be the yardstick by which companies think about how technology is advancing their strategy, their strategic positioning. The first is nimbleness. Is the application of technology allowing you to pivot more quickly to external circumstances and take advantage of new opportunities, or fight back against risks that may be presenting themselves in the external environment? Is technology allowing you to scale up or scale down to meet demand from the marketplace in a more seamless way? Is technology making you more stable and resilient to external shocks to the system, whether those are acute or chronic? And lastly, by being more engaged with technology and digital innovation, does your business have more options from which to select from? Be that partnerships, be that experiments that you have done that can be scaled to create new routes to market, new ways to attract talent, etc. So by being more digitally matured, more digitally engaged, you should have more options at your disposal, which make you, again, a stronger player. And I think one of our interviews kind of summed up this notion of digitally mature organizations being able to innovate and thrive. And the leadership team at Google Cloud, as they were facing the disruption that we were all facing in the spring of 2020, they said, look, we were made for this moment. The organization that we are, how we think about our customers, how we think about cloud and all the associated technologies within the cloud, we were made for this moment. And I think we're in a golden era where every organization has the opportunity to think that they're made for this moment if they choose to enhance their digital maturity. With that, I'll turn it over to An.
Thanks, Rich. Hi, everyone. So as Rich just talked about, technology can absolutely give us very important and transformative capabilities. But, just a reminder, as we pointed out in the technology fallacy, just simply focusing on acquiring technology is not likely to yield the results that companies are looking for. The people aspect is absolutely critical, and it can't be seen as secondary in importance. So we can look at the people aspect in two primary ways. The first is from the talent angle, and these are the people in and outside of your organization who think of, who create, who deliver the company's values, its products, its services. And we see that people are a competitive edge and drivers of transformation. The second one, which we'll cover after this, is from a customer angle. And they're the people who consume and receive the products and services. So let's start with the talent. Undoubtedly, the biggest impact the pandemic has had in the workplace has been the shift to remote work, particularly for knowledge workers. And we've heard so many stories about how companies that have shifted to remote work had to do so overnight in the matter of just a day or two. And this, I think, showed that it really wasn't about the technology, because the technology was there to support this shift in remote work. But it's really about organizational inertia and their inability to actually change unless they were forced to. So the shift to remote work did not have, sort of the negative impact on productivity that a lot of companies feared, but it did have an impact on both culture and connection within the organization. And so some organizations like Humana, for example, whom we've interviewed, they tried to figure out how to combat this and fight against it by exploring safe ways for their employees to meet and stay connected. They set up pop-up offices in a large park near their office, where they basically had this large tent that people would be sheltered from the weather, and Wi-Fi and restrooms and food trucks. And it really allowed their people to figure out how to come together in a safe place during the pandemic, or in a safe way during the pandemic. But as we are starting to shift in the pandemic and companies are preparing for post-pandemic workplace, we're seeing a lot of range of responses in terms of what companies plan on doing. Some companies are requiring all their employees to come back into the office, and then others are letting their workers stay remote indefinitely. But I think the key is that the genie is now out of the bottle. And so many companies are going to have to they're going to find it difficult to force all of their people back into the office every single day. So most likely many organizations will opt for some version of like a hybrid workplace where people are coming together at certain times and for certain objectives. So the pandemic showed that leaders and employees that it was possible to work remotely and possible to act and move quickly when needed. So the question is whether or not companies can actually take the lessons that were learned during this period, figure out what was good and what needed to be worked on, such as culture and connection, and then how to actually create the workplace of the future. And so if you just focus on the workplace though, then there's a missed opportunity. There's a missed opportunity to do something more. And when we look at the future of work, we actually think of it in terms of a three-legged stool. One is the work itself, how the work is being done, the workforce, the people and the tools behind that work who are doing the work, and then finally the workplace. So this is really an opportunity, as Jerry and Rich talked about, this is an opportunity to really thrive and to shape the path forward. So doing that by just focusing on workplace and answering the question of remote versus in-person versus hybrid is really missing an opportunity to actually fundamentally redesign the way work is being done and who does that work. If you think about it, all of the shifts in technology that we've had in the past, from machines taking over in the fields to taking over in the factories to now taking over in the offices, it meant that people had to shift what they were doing and oftentimes shift to more value added and more human sort of skill sets that they have to lean on, such as critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, and empathy. So how do we actually move that work and redesign it in a way that's going to help the company be more innovative, be more competitive, be more creative? Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the other aspect of the people dimension, and that's really the end customers. So in times of disruption, particularly acute disruptions, customers' habits are shaken and their needs often shift. So I think about how personally, I've shifted my buying habits within the early days of the pandemic. It could be because things that I normally buy were not available. It could be because the stores that I normally went to or the channels that I normally purchased through were not available. So this is really an opportunity to actually think about your customers, to think about how they might be shifting their habits, and how you might either retain your existing customers or use this as an opportunity to get new customers whose habits are shaken. When we looked at how customers were actually deciding where to shift their habits and where to buy and what to buy, the element of trust was a big factor, especially in times of uncertainty, especially in times of crisis. And so if we look at that aspect of trust, we can break it down to 4 kind of primary components. 2 of them have to do with signaling whether or not that company is going to be competent, whether or not that company is going to be reliable, whether or not that company is going to provide the capabilities that you're looking for in your products or your services. And that's absolutely important because those are table stakes. So if you as an organization can't be reliable for your customers, and if you can't offer the capabilities and the range of capabilities that they're looking for, whether that's omni-channel experience, or whether that's just a consistent and reliable product offerings, then it's going to be a challenge to actually attract and retain those customers. And then the other aspect of this is taking a look at 2 components that signal sort of intent of the organization. And this is what we think about when we think of the word trust. So it's about the company's humanity and their transparency and how that's represented in what they do and how they offer their products. So humanity is about whether or not the company cares for the experience and well-being of others, including their customers, their employees, and the broader community. So how well do they actually signal that they care for their people, for their customers? How are they treating their employees? Do they, in the early days of the pandemic especially, were they taking precautions to protect their employees? Were they taking precautions to protect their customers? And then transparency, how open are they? How open are they in terms of sharing information about their intentions? How open are they in terms of sharing their information of how they use your data when they're collecting your data, what kind of data they're collecting from you, and how they're using it? So all of these traits and signals, I think, are important all the time, but they can become even more important in times of disruption where customers' habits are shaken. Okay, so we'll end with one final note that we'll leave you all with. What was clear in all of the stories that we heard is that these organizations that we interviewed, these executives that we spoke to, they were able to gain clarity and direction by rallying around a common purpose, whether that was to care for frontline workers or to continue to provide critical services to their customers. They really focused around a common reason of why they existed and why they were doing what it is that they were doing. So purpose is an important guiding light, I think, in normal times, but it becomes even more necessary in times of acute disruption and in times of uncertainty and in times of ambiguity. So rallying around a common purpose is a great place to start if you haven't already. And then also tied to that, absolutely critical, are being very clear about what your values are as an organization, because the values are what creates guardrails and guidelines for how to actually execute. And if you think about an organization that's trying to be nimble and trying to push all the decision making down into the front lines, you're going to have a strong set of values to guide your employees in terms of the decisions that they make, so that they are making decisions that are aligned with your company's values, that are going to uphold all of the company's hows of how they do things. And then finally, being very clear on what that mission is, what that immediate mission is, what that immediate priority is, what it is you're actually trying to get done at that moment is absolutely critical. So the executives we spoke to, said that during this time, they increased their communications, and lots of organizations were hearing from their leaders a lot more often. And being that voice that constantly reiterates and makes clear what the purpose is, what the values of the organization are, and what the mission of the organization are absolutely critical in order to be that North Star, in order to be that guiding light that actually enables people to push through the cloud of uncertainty that's in front of them in times of disruption. Okay, so you can pick up a copy of The Transformation Myth in your favorite bookstore. And I think that Emily has also put some other links in here to relevant places that you can go to find more.
Yes, thank you so much.
The only thing I would add to that, Emily, is that link on the D.com page, Deloitte.com/US Transformation Myth, or on my website, www.profkane.com. We've published a number of the interviews as a series in the Wall Street Journal because we just had too much good stuff to make it all into the book. And so we highlighted some of our interviews there, and you can get those on the web.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for this great presentation. And we'll put links in the chat for where folks can find the book. In the meantime, I think we'll head over to questions. And I'll put my video back on even. So one question, and I think that just sort of came up out of Jerry, what you were saying about the interviews. I'm wondering if there was a particular story or an example from your research that really kind of encapsulated a company that was facing the challenge of acute disruption and handling it especially well, or if there was something that was maybe an opportunity to learn from. If you want to speak to that a bit.
Oh, I have so many interesting stories about that because this was, I think, the most rewarding part of the book was like getting to talk to these executives as they were going through this sort of really crazy experience. And you had, some like those in hospitality industry. We interviewed people from Marriott and from Hilton that saw a 90% decrease in demand overnight. And they said, 9/11 was nothing compared to what we're dealing with here from a hospitality perspective. But yet there were opportunities there for them to sort of think creatively. So Hilton took their recruiting system and reversed it. So it used to be apply for a job with Hilton through this site, and they reversed it. So Hilton employees that they knew were going to have to get laid off, Hilton went and created partnerships with those companies that were experiencing increased demand for employees, the Amazons, the grocery stores, the UPSs, and they created a preferred hiring platform by which these companies that needed employees knew that the people were applying, they were from Hilton, they had a certain level of quality, the company vouched for them. And because they were able to do this, and this goes back to On's, need to operate within humanity, Hilton was voted the third best place to work in America, despite having laid off 55,000 people that year. And so, and they said it was because they treated us with dignity and humanity, and they worked on our behalf. And so just those, so that's, one example from the downside. And then, Humana, we talked about needing to, they realized early on in the pandemic that one of the things that their members were dealing with was food insecurity. And they said our mission is to provide for the best, or whatever it is, provide the best health for our members. They said, how do we do this if our members are going hungry? So they stood up a food delivery service in the midst of the pandemic and delivered over 1 million meals in March, April, and May of 2020. And that's like, who would have thought a health insurer to provide meals for people? And yet they reinterpreted their mission accordingly. And I won't keep going, but I could spend the next 30 minutes just telling you cool examples and stories that we came across, and On and Rich may have some of their own.
Maybe I'll add one and then draw some parallels to those that Jerry shared. But Anthem, we write about in the book, and their the chief digital officer Rajiv Ronanki, and he talked about how well before the pandemic, Anthem had an ambition and saw a future where they actually needed to be an information and an insight platform that connected patients and providers and health insurers in a more seamless way. And so they made significant investments to modernize their data, to build artificial intelligence that helped manage and move that data around in more intuitive and impactful ways for all the people in their in their universe. And those investments prior to the pandemic paid off, because they were able to find patients who, because of the health situation, were not going to receive care. They were worried about contracting the virus, so they stayed at home. But their algorithms and the vast data sets they had created allowed them to create nudges that inform people that they actually needed to go in and it was safe to do so, or there were telemedicine approaches for them to get the care that they needed. And so the investments that were made and the purpose that was created for that organization prior to the pandemic paid huge dividends for the company and provided vital support for people during the pandemic. And you can draw the same connection to the Hilton example, and they made these investments in HR systems that created nimbleness and optionality and scalability during the pandemic in a way they never could have imagined.
Rich, I'm so glad that you brought up that story, because I was actually thinking of Anthem, and the next thing I know, you're talking about it. So, one of my favorites was the Beam Suntory story, where, in the early days of the pandemic, there was a shortage of so many things, including hand sanitizer. And a lot of frontline workers really needed that. So the spirits maker, they don't normally make hand sanitizer, but they thought, we really want to help. We really want to contribute. This is about, helping out our community. And they, within the span of 2 weeks, were able to go from not producing any hand sanitizer to turning one of their factories into making hand sanitizer and then donating that to frontline workers. I mean, what was so amazing about that story is, they had to put together, they'd never done this before. They had to put together cross-functional teams that included people from all the different functions, including legal and including regulatory, because it turns out that making hand sanitizer isn't just as simple as putting alcohol in there. You actually have to change the nature of the alcohol so that it tastes bitter and nobody would want to eat hand sanitizer. So they had to do all of this in such a short period. And the fact that they were able to do it with cross-functional teams is what I find so amazing, and completely turn a factory that they had from making spirits into doing this.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Those are great stories. And if you want to read more about these and others, definitely folks should check out the book. We have a couple other questions. One that sort of came up while Rich was talking, and it's related to another one. So I'm going to sort of combine these two. How does artificial intelligence treat the public with dignity and humanity in today's economy? And I think that's also sort of tied to this question of digital maturity. And, you know, with AI in particular, there's so much where sort of AI is leading the way, and companies and the rest of the economy sort of has to follow. So how do you think about that? How do you sort of wrap your head around the effects that AI is having on both, you know, sort of humanity and then also the economy?
Unless An or Rich wants to jump into this one, and I'm not hearing enthusiastic offers to do so.
You can
So I'll put on my professor hat right now. I'll put on my professor hat for a moment, and that is, you know, I think we're only at, you know, inning one of a long game with respect to artificial intelligence. I think it is the real deal. I think we don't quite know how to use it and apply it yet, and I think the future for AI is huge. At the same time, I think, so I was interviewing the chief digital officer of a large insurance company for the research for the previous book, and I always end my interviews with, is there something I should have asked but didn't? And he said, yes, the thing you should have asked is, how do we start thinking about the type of world we want to build with these technologies? Because if we don't think about that now, we're going to end up with a lot of really flashy, cool technologies inside a really pretty crummy society, organizations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So whether it's AI, whether it's blockchain, whether it's anything coming down the pipe, I think we need to be more intentional about the type of world we want to create with these technologies. And it's executive leaders that need to have those types of conversations and discussions. And I think we are coming up to a remarkable opportunity over the next 1 to 3 to 5 years, which, you know, as we were talking with executives, the digital folks, they were giddy about what was happening, not because of COVID, but because they had unprecedented, I use the word unprecedented again, opportunity to push forward their plans with relatively little resistance. And now that the world has been disrupted, it's really an opportunity to rethink, how do we want to use artificial intelligence? How do we want to use cloud? How do we want to use blockchain? And what type of better organizations and societies can we come up with? And so I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, other than the answer is to start having these conversations. And now is the ideal time to do that. And I'm afraid if we don't have it over the next 3 to 5 years, that opportunity will have, we will have missed that opportunity to do so.
I think I'd add to it, and this is, by the way, we've talked, this could actually be the subject of another book, which is forecasting all the derivatives of the new capabilities we're building with technology and how to shepherd those for, you know, a better future. I think one add is all of this AI, right? Humans are harnessing the data, writing the algorithms and tuning those algorithms, right? So it's will continue to be a people-driven initiation of whatever, you know, the AI, you know, does on its own, and they have to be managed and tuned by the, you know, the organizations that create them. And so, you know, there has to be very clear understanding of companies about that, right? It's like, as the transformation says, it's not a one and done. That needs to be done in the context of a purpose, which we write about in the book. And if there's a purpose, then, you know, we can know that there's an intent we're trying to accomplish with AI, and we can continue to focus and channel the AI in that direction. Having said all that, though, the second and third derivatives of how we apply technology to our purpose, there needs to be framing and governance within organizations for how that happens. And I think what we're seeing with social media right now is a really great example that, 10 or 15 years in, these algorithms are doing things behavior-wise with people that we hadn't intended. And now, we need to understand how to bring them back to purpose, do so in a way that is good for the organization and its purpose, as well as for society at large. And if those organizations don't sort that from themselves, it will get regulated upon them eventually. And so I think it's a real interesting, highly complicated, no right answer view of, why these second and third derivatives of how technology is applied, need to be thought through, as hard as that is, at their initiation.
Yeah, I mean, what Jerry said about an opportunity to shape the future intentionally, what Rich said about leading with purpose, I mean, that's ultimately what we're saying in the transformation myth too, and one added element too is it's about constant evolution and constant transformation. So if you design something and it has some unintended consequences, that's when you have to actually continue to pay attention to it. So it's not just let's build this and leave it and move on to something else. It's how do we continue to make sure that the things that we're designing and developing are really aligned to our purpose, to our vision, to the values that we have as an organization. And I think that sort of constant attention to it is absolutely critical.
Thanks. And I feel like a lot of that also tied into the point that Ann had been making earlier about transparency and sort of how, you can say, here's what we're doing in response to this crisis, but it's not really viewed as authentic until there's some sort of proof behind it. And that feels like that's going to be an important part of the conversation as well. We have a couple of other questions that have come in, and I think AI has really sparked a lot of interest and sort of questions in the chat. This sort of comment, AI isn't intelligent. I feel it's trending toward being like codified law, knowledge being interpreted and used by an executive center similar to low-level district court judges without recourse to a Supreme Court. There's no understanding. And then another sort of related AI question is how challenging is it for businesses to understand the difference between model-centric and data-centric AI solutions? What pushback do each get? And that might be sort of more sort of specific than kind of what's talked about in the book. But I'm curious if you have any sort of thoughts about sort of the different ways that companies can use AI and what things they need to be thinking about as they're doing this, thinking about, the guardrails and the guidelines and things like that.
I can take a first stab. I think the way I interpret that question has a lot to do with what is the the specific asset that a company has that it's trying to connect to its purpose and how value is created, right? So is it a model and a set of algorithms, or is it some unique data or data sets? And how those are then harnessed and scaled for sure will have different different approaches, though they eventually will converge and the data needs to meet the model and vice versa. I think the majority of incumbent companies are sitting on data sets that have some intrinsic value that they're then looking to monetize and create create more value from. You have a lot of platform companies and digital natives that maybe are coming at it from, hey, we understand how to connect and apply AI to existing data sets in a new and novel way and create innovation. So you do get, I think, a little bit of the incumbent versus the disruptor frame there on who's coming at this with a model and who's coming at it with some data. So maybe that's one way to think about the two.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. Another sort of earlier in the talk, you had spoken about the capabilities for organizations. that, organizations need to sort of facilitate and foster in order to be able to respond to both acute and chronic disruptions. What skills or capabilities are needed for individual leaders or individual workers? And how does that differ? Does it, is it the same or different?
Yeah, we actually did some research on this that was in our first book, and definitely in times like this, it's about having vision. It's about being forward-looking. It's about being change-oriented. So wanting to kind of push that change across the organization, but also it's about being tech savvy or tech literate, right? So no matter who you are, no matter what kind of part of the organization that you lead, whether that's technical or business, it's really about understanding the potential and possibilities of technology and how that can be used and harnessed in order to create a vision, in order to create a future for your organization. So being open to all of that. And then I think, during the pandemic and during times of acute disruption, being able to be a strong communicator and having empathy, I think are critical leadership traits to be able to navigate your organization, right? As I mentioned, the number of communications from leaders to their organization just increased so much during the pandemic, and it needed to. And there was even a feeling that leaders were more authentic during those times as well. So having all of those traits, I think, is a great place to start. Jerry and Rich probably have more to add to that list.
I was just going to say, well said. Nothing to add from my side.
Yeah, I can let On's words stand.
Sounds good. I would say one of the things that I've taken away, from this book and from this presentation is that sort of return to normal is a really missed opportunity, and that sort of breaking out of that mindset is really important. So how can organizations fight the urge, and I realize that that's like the whole, sort of premise of the book is recognizing how not to, but if there was like one thing that you could encourage an organization that's maybe thinking like, okay, cool, in a couple months we're going to be back in the office, or maybe we're already back and like we're just going to keep on doing what we were doing, like what is the one thing that you would say, like, stop, try something else?
That's a great question. I think for me, and I may come up with another answer after On and Rich give their answers, but I think, and I have some real concerns. We did a webinar with Sloan Management Review, and we actually polled the audience, and most of our respondents said they were actually somewhat optimistic their organization was going to be different going forward. So I have some hope with that data. I think the stick is going to be talent. I think now just this awareness that people at this day and time, at this juncture, organizations need people more than people need the organizations. And now there is so much more opportunity for people to be intentional about how they're going to work. And there's no right answer here. Some people want to be, like my undergrads, they absolutely want to be in person in an office. More middle-aged people like me, if I never go back to the office again for the next decade, I'm completely fine with that. And different people are going to have different preferences. And if you just go back to the way things were, you are going to place yourself at such a competitive disadvantage because your talent is going to start finding things that they want to do. And if you're not creative and intentional about building the type of organization that's going to attract the type of people you want to work there, you're just going to find yourself at such a hiring disadvantage. We've heard it say, what is it? The talent. It's a talent loss for many organizations, but one organization's talent loss is a gain for another one that figures out how to do it right. And I think, when all is said and done, I think that is going to be the factor that's going to force companies to sort of rethink what they're going to look like. Rich.
You want to just to, maybe add one thought there. You want to be a net importer during the Great Resignation, right? So that's a very clear measure of, who's making progress versus who's falling behind. I think, in brief, that we are entering a new golden era of innovation, and which implies we aren't returning to any kind of 2019 normal. And companies that take the lead and shape their future in a very provocative way, I think will separate themselves from others. And so it is going to be and I think this is at least a decade of a golden era. So there's urgency, but there's also a lot of time where this is going to sort itself out, and just embracing, right, that it's a golden era of great change, and being a change agent, versus being on the sidelines is the advice I'd have for leaders.
Yeah, Emily, I think that it's easy, and it probably a natural instinct to feel like we've been running so fast and burning so hot. And, companies and lots of leaders and lots of people feel like they just want to take their foot off the pedal and relax a bit or rest a bit, right? So I think that that's a natural feeling. But the big question is, well, when will the disruption stop? And I don't know that they will, right? Because companies are still trying to figure out how to get back into the workplace. There's still, as Jerry and Rich talked about, the great resignation, this battle for talent. There's still a lot of political unrest. There's still climate change. I mean, there are lots of issues that aren't going to stop. So the question is, how can you as an organization build up your capabilities so that you're better to withstand all of this and better to run that marathon than always feeling like you're out of breath?
I think that's a really great point. And thank you to the three of you for some really provocative insights and clear thinking about these challenges and the way forward. To learn more about the transformation myth, you can go ahead and visit our website at mitpress.mit.edu. And if you want to support independent bookstores, we have a list of a few different ways that you can get your hands on our books. And if you want to register for other events in the MIT Press Live series, you can find them all listed on our website. And you can also find videos of this and other events in the series on our blog at mitpress.mit.edu/blog. Thank you so much for joining us, Jerry, Ann, and Rich. It has been so great speaking with you today, and I really appreciate you taking the time, and to our audience for joining us and asking some great questions. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
Take care.